Welcome. My name is Adam Neiman. I am the Artistic Director of the Manchester Music Festival, and I will be your host for this episode of Get to Know the Music. This episode explores the extraordinary lives and work of several important female composers, including Louise Farrenc, Fanny Mendelssohn-Hensel, Clara Schumann, Cecile Chaminade, Mel Bonis, and Amy Beach. It must be a sign of talent that I do not give up, though I can get nobody to take an interest in my efforts. This quote by Fanny Mendelssohn-Hensel is frustratingly indicative of most women composers' journeys throughout the ages. By shining light on the plight of female composers throughout history, we are forced to face some uncomfortable truths about the many barriers society has erected. Female composers have struggled to attain publication, were rarely accepted on stage as solo performers, and have been viewed at various stages in history as intellectually inferior to men. Not having received education equal to their male counterparts, women could not realistically expect to ever rise to the post of professor at any university. Even attending university was a rarity, seen as corrupting the natural order of things as women studied and worked alongside male students. Many talented women were pressured by their families into unwanted marriages, and their husbands inevitably expected them to raise the family and keep the home, placing family concerns before any musical aspirations. Generally speaking, society frowned upon women who cultivated public personae as professional musicians, even if those women could miraculously manage all of their family responsibilities while somehow leaving time for creative endeavors. As a result, a number of prominent artists took androgynous or male names so as to conceal their true gender. In fact, we shall be discussing one such artist today. These barriers read as a litany of nearly insurmountable obstacles that have prevented so many deserving women from pursuing their creative endeavors with the same public acceptance as men have enjoyed. Given those facts, it is no wonder that the average concert-goer struggles to name more than a few noteworthy female composers. And it is certainly a travesty that few, if any, female composers are accepted among the pantheon of great composers. And yet, it has not always been so. There are inspiring examples of women throughout history whose stories serve as more than adequate refutation of the chauvinistic attitudes so ingrained in the fabric of society. Women who struggled for acceptance and legitimacy, and in doing so forged indelible paths for those who would follow, and women who succeeded against all odds to achieve things on the grandest of scales. In the realm of history and politics, one can't help but ponder the alternate, possibly better, outcomes of history had rulers such as Empress Matilda or Queen Joanna I of Naples overcome the intense resistance to their rule as women. while Matilda's throne was cunningly snatched away from her by Stephen of Blois before she could make her mark on post-conquest England, Joanna I did, in fact, rule Naples for many years, though not without a mix of bitter failures caused by the disruptive machinations of her 4 husbands, whose political rivalries severely hamstrung her rule. For more information about Joanna I, who was a fascinating figure in Middle Age history, I highly recommend the book The Lady Queen by Nancy Goldstone. Of course, legendary rulers such as Elizabeth I of England and Catherine the Great of Russia positively transformed the world through their visionary leadership and extraordinary legacies, and their examples certainly reset the scales. Politics aside, any informed discussion of female composers in the history of classical music should aptly begin with a towering figure who serves as an extraordinary example in so many regards. Saint Hildegard von Bingen, who lived during the majority of the 12th century. Not only is Hildegard von Bingen recognized as the first known composer in European history. Now wait a minute, really let that sink in. Not just the first female composer, the first composer, period. Not only is she recognized as such, but the Benedictine abbess was canonized in 2012 for her achievements as a mystic visionary, religious and scientific author, whose medical observations have been lauded for their unusual level of insight and accuracy regarding the natural world, as well as for her extensive output as a composer of sacred poems, antiphons, and morality plays. Her lifespan of 81 years was unprecedented, and her achievements across a broad array of topics render her both astonishing and inspirational. If you haven't listened to her music, I strongly suggest doing so. There are many recent recordings of her works that do great justice to the transcendental beauty and magic of her style. And YouTube is a great place to start your research. Just type in her name and give it a listen. Let's examine the permissible forms of a relationship with music available to women throughout, well, the majority of Western post-Roman history. Obviously, women like Hildegard von Bingen and the monarchs I mentioned earlier are the exceptions, not the rule. More typical for women was to serve society in one of 3 accepted roles. That of a nun, whose commitment to a life serving the church would obviously exempt her from existing or future matrimonial duties and maternal obligations. Her contemplative life would potentially facilitate a relationship with music through prayer, either intoning prayers written for the church by others or by occasionally composing prayers herself. Some nuns would teach basic music skills to girls in the convent for the purpose of prayer and spiritual enhancement, and thus would be allowed to delve fairly deeply into the craft themselves, so long as that intellectual pursuit did not distract from a devotion to God. Within the relative safe space of her sisterhood, a nun could enjoy music alongside her sisters, not as a form of entertainment, of course, but as a way of connecting more deeply with spirituality, which would be the intended purpose of the music she would be exposed to within her order. Music as a pastime or professional calling would have been seen as heretical for a nun, so she would not pursue publication or outside recognition of her work. Again, von Bingen is the exception, but it was actually others, including the Pope, who encouraged her to publish. A nun's life and work would remain private, within the confines of her order, always maintaining the primary goal of spiritual communion with the Creator. It is a certainty that thousands of talented women, many with musical gifts, likely found a home within the church, voluntarily or otherwise, whose music or music performance we will simply never know. Within a different stratum of society, a woman could be born an aristocrat, as daughter and future wife of a lord, earl, duke, or king. As a lady of society, she would be educated somewhat, at least to the degree expected and accepted by the patriarchal society in which she was born, though some women were educated to a higher degree by more liberal-minded fathers who permitted these women to share studies with their brothers, or who might be realistically in line for future rule. Within this privileged aristocratic universe, a woman might learn to play an instrument or two, perhaps a simple strummed instrument or flute, or, after the 17th century, a keyboard instrument. A fairly long list of aristocratic women were indeed able to publish a limited number of incidental compositions of their own. These works were written often for social or political occasions, at which the presentation of music by the lady, princess, queen, or otherwise would be received as a charming token of regal favor to the visiting dignitaries. Keep in mind, an aristocratic woman would certainly be expected to bear children, but she would not be responsible for the day-to-day raising of those children. Time was left to her to arrange her own court, or to attend the court of a higher-ranked mistress who might cherish artists, poets, bards, musicians, etc. In this way, an aristocratic woman would have significant exposure to instrumental music as either a player herself or as an observer. Her pedigree as a musician would increase her social value to those around her, so her family could expect her to be recruited into the best social circles by virtue of her musical affinities. Music, in this realm, was a strong currency of feminine sophistication and attractiveness. As a mother and mistress of a household, she would be given a certain latitude to shape the education of her children. Thus, a woman could bequeath an appreciation for the arts to her progeny via education. A lay woman was the least likely to have a significant relationship with music. The simple facts of economics were the dominant factors here. A lay woman would serve at the lowest stratum of society, devoid of education, and certainly without any formal music studies. A lay woman would undoubtedly be exposed to sung music, such as folk and popular tunes, but contact with formal instrumental music would have been reserved for those luckier women who could afford the price of admittance at court by means of familial connections of their own, or by advancing up the ladder to the upper echelons of courtly servitude. It is easy to explain, then, why we really don't know of many lay female composers until the 19th century. Women composers began to emerge notably in France and Germany, where more republican tendencies were taking root as the monarchy was gradually swept away by changing political tides. Though England maintained its monarchy, the reign of Queen Victoria, reigned 1837 to 1901, is marked by an embrace of many aspects of the political revolutions happening abroad, seeing within its borders a newfound emphasis on individual liberties, the right to vote expanding inclusively, a shift towards societal secularism, the rise of working social classes, and significant investment in public education. The results of these political metamorphoses include the improved visibility and accessibility of a classical arts culture, with many public performance spaces and events being institutionalized, and the advent of the virtuoso rock stars that helped shape the age, characters like Liszt, Chopin, Paganini, and the Romantic poets. Space simply opened up for women to make their mark with improved public awareness and legitimacy. As stated, the period of burgeoning female compositional talent in the 19th century facilitated the creative activities of some remarkable women. I would point out a seeming correlation between the epochs of romantic tendencies, with more inclusive policies toward females in positions of power and creative influence, whereas more classical epochs tend toward more exclusionary policies. I point you to a previous episode of the Manchester Music Festival Digital Concert Hall, the Get to Know the Music talk about classical and romantic, in which I explore the oscillating phenomena of these bipolar human tendencies, politically and musically. The conversation topics outlined in that episode certainly tie in closely with our present discussion, so I encourage you to go back and revisit it at your leisure. Let us now dive into the magic of 7 extraordinary female composers from the 19th and early 20th centuries. These women will be the focus of Manchester Music Festival's next event, which is a performance chat celebrating female composers. I will be performing a full recital of piano works by these 7 marvelous composers, introducing each work and then performing them in full. Don't miss this follow-up event, July 2nd at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The French composer-pianist Louise Farrenc was born in 1804 and died in 1875. Her maiden name was Jean-Louise Dumont, and she grew up in a well-respected arts family. Her father and brother, Jacques Edme and Auguste, respectively, were renowned sculptors, and their work and success enabled the Dumont family to live at the Sorbonne Faculty of Arts. The Sorbonne was one of 5 educational bodies founded by Napoleon Bonaparte as part of his vision of education reform in France, and the Sorbonne cultivated a reputation as one of the finest institutions in the world. It was in the midst of this environment that the young Louise demonstrated a prodigious musical talent, and, with her parents' full support, she had the privilege of studying with 2 virtuoso legends of the day, Ignaz Moscheles and Johann Nepomuk Hummel. These pianists circulated at the highest levels of musical society and were considered the pianistic equals of Liszt, Chopin, Alkan, and other hyper-virtuoso quasi-rock stars of the day. Louise's highly technical piano works, one of which I will perform to open the performance chat broadcast on July 2nd at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, are a testament to the tools she acquired as a pianist. It is therefore no wonder that she was accepted to the Paris Conservatoire at the tender age of 15, where she studied composition with Anton Reicha, a well-known and respected pedagogue. Just to give you an idea, he was also the composition teacher of Liszt, Berlioz, and Franck. It is important to note that though Paris was one of the most liberal urban centers in the world in 1819, it was still a relative rarity for a woman to be accepted as a university student. The rate of female acceptance in those days was only 10%, and women were not permitted to study composition there until 1870. The fact that Reicha accepted Louise nonetheless testifies to the depth of his respect for her. Her musical sensibility and compositional sophistication benefited greatly, as evidenced by the impeccable quality of her compositions across many genres, including symphonies, chamber music, song, and solo piano works. It was at the Conservatoire that she met a fellow student, flutist Aristide Farrenc. They fell in love, and they were married in 1821. This partnership would prove not only personally fulfilling, but professionally vital, as I will elucidate momentarily. Shortly after their marriage, Louise and Aristide booked a concert tour together as a flute and piano duo, and this required Louise to put a temporary hold on her studies. Aristide quickly tired of the rigmarole of concert life, and he also quite graciously admitted to Louise his relative mediocrity as a flutist and her superiority as a musician. They agreed to abandon the concert tour, and he set out to support and bolster Louise's burgeoning career. He encouraged Louise to resume and complete her studies with Reicha at the Conservatoire, while he set up a publishing business. He went on to found and successfully operate the Édition Farrenc, and Louise completed her studies at the Conservatoire in a timely fashion. Farrenc's early compositions caught the attention of such luminaries as Schumann and Berlioz, and Farrenc immediately accelerated her fame across Europe by embarking on a solo concert tour. Her pianism was universally lauded, and her music was very well received, particularly by the Illuminati. Her career briefly paused in 1826 when she gave birth to her daughter, Victorine, who also, incidentally, became a concert pianist. Afterward, Louise resumed her activities with full vigor, going on to write many works and to perform as soloist and chamber musician to great critical acclaim. Quite extraordinarily, Louise Farrenc achieved in 1842 what so few women had ever achieved. She was appointed full professor of piano at the Paris Conservatoire, where she taught for the remainder of her life. It is noteworthy that upon discovering that her salary at the Conservatoire was lower than that of her male colleagues, she insisted upon equal pay. It took her several attempts for this to finally yield results. After a particularly successful concert in which the famous violinist Joseph Joachim performed one of her works, she publicly advocated for salary equity, and the tactic worked. This incident has elevated Louise Farrenc's contemporary reputation to that of feminist maverick, as she set an important precedent for gender equality in the workplace. One unfortunate policy that Farrenc was unable to change was that women were not permitted to teach composition at the Conservatoire. She was only permitted to teach piano, a fact that she accepted reluctantly, though she dedicated herself with great enthusiasm to her piano studio, and she earned universal acclaim as an instructor. Her status as a central musical figure in Paris was secure, and she was the 3-time recipient of the prestigious Chartier Prize. Tragically, her daughter, Victorine, died at 33 years old, and Louise Farrenc never again composed, though she continued to teach piano at the Conservatoire until her death in 1875. The German composer-pianist Fanny Mendelssohn-Hensel was born in 1805 and died in 1847. She was raised in a highly intellectual Jewish family. Her grandfather, Moses Mendelssohn, was a famous Jewish philosopher. Her father, Abraham, made the decision to convert the family to Christianity so as to avoid the rapidly escalating anti-Semitism insidiously making its way through German society. All the members of the family were baptized, and they also took the last name Bartholdi, again to conceal their innate Jewish identity. Fanny was the firstborn child of 4. Her younger brother was none other than Felix Mendelssohn. Though the family presented itself outwardly as Christian, their philosophy and family principles were grounded in Judaism. One of these principles was the strong emphasis on education, making no distinction between the education of a man or woman. Abraham permitted Fanny to receive the identical education to her siblings, and as a result, her education was absolutely top tier. Her musical gifts revealed themselves early on, and, like Felix, she was given music lessons with 2 famous teachers, Ludwig Berger, who taught piano to the children, and Carl Friedrich Zelter, who taught them composition. As Fanny matured and reached her mid-teens, it became apparent that an existential moment was upon her. She wished to be a professional musician, and by all accounts, she was every bit the genius as Felix, even better, according to their teachers. Nonetheless, the societal model of the period held back her family from supporting this aim, and while her musical activities as a youngster were tolerated, they were not encouraged beyond a certain age. As a concession to Fanny, some of her early piano compositions were published amidst Felix's early compositions under Felix's name, as it was considered unseemly for a woman to publish in her own name. To address Fanny's mixed feelings about all this, her father Abraham wrote to her in 1820, "Music will perhaps become Felix's profession, while for you it can and must be only an ornament." Felix shared this sentiment, writing to a friend later, after Fanny's marriage, "From my knowledge of Fanny, I should say that she has neither inclination nor vocation for authorship. She is too much all that a woman ought to be for this. She regulates her house, and neither thinks of the public nor of the musical world, nor even of music at all, until her first duties are fulfilled. Publishing would only disturb her in these, and I cannot say that I approve of it." Nonetheless, the bond between Fanny and Felix was very strong, and Fanny became Felix's musical confidant. He sought her advice frequently, and he would make changes in his music only when Fanny suggested such changes. They were tied at the hip, musically speaking, often playing together, even working on composition projects in tandem, such as an opera that they simultaneously drafted to the same subject, consulting each other at every turn. In 1829, Fanny married her longtime suitor, the artist Wilhelm Hensel, and together they had a son, Sebastian Ludwig Felix. Fanny's public music career officially launched in 1838 when she appeared as piano soloist in Felix's Piano Concerto No. 1. She was instantly regarded as one of the finest pianists of the age. Her marriage to Wilhelm was a happy one, and he was among the minority of men who actually encouraged Fanny to publish in her own name. He beseeched her constantly to believe more in her own talent, and though at first she resisted the idea, not wanting to alienate her family, she eventually grew emboldened to compose more. Subsequently, she did proceed to publish works in her own name in 1846. Felix, who was not consulted by Fanny or Wilhelm when she made the decision to publish, responded nonetheless with grace. I send you my professional blessing on becoming a member of the craft. May you have much happiness in giving pleasure to others. May you taste only the sweets and none of the bitterness of authorship. May the public pelt you with roses and never with sand. Her compositions were lauded by many. She made strong friendships of her own with such figures as Clara Schumann and Hector Berlioz, as well as Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Her professional aspirations began to grow, but tragically, her life was cut short in 1847 when she died of a stroke. I will mention here as a footnote that Felix was so devastated he never recovered. He wrote only one composition after her death, his Grimm String Quartet in F minor, and then he too subsequently died of a stroke 6 months after Fanny's passing. The renowned German composer-pianist Clara Schumann was born in 1819 and died just prior to the turn of the 20th century. Her maiden name was Clara Wieck, and in 1824, when Clara was just 5 years old, her father Friedrich divorced her mother Marianne. The relationship had long soured due to incompatible personalities, but the event that put the nail in the coffin, so to speak, was Marianne's scandalous extramarital affair. Consequently, Clara went to live with her father, as he was granted sole custody. Friedrich was an accomplished pianist himself, and in recognition of Clara's clear musical gifts, he dedicated himself to training her to be a concert pianist. The intensity of her training was remarkable, and in 1828, when Clara was 9 years old, she gave her debut recital in Leipzig. In the years that followed, she toured throughout Europe, and one of her tricks, as it were, was that she played everything by memory. This was unprecedented. No one played music by memory unless it was the composer playing his or her own work. Her memorized recitals became the stuff of legend, and her meteoric professional rise facilitated her intersection with many renowned artists, such as Paganini, Chopin, and Liszt, all of whom proclaimed her to be among the greatest pianists in the world. One individual who recognized Clara's talents early on was the young Robert Schumann, who so admired Clara's talent and skills that he lobbied for himself to study directly under the tutelage of her father. The relationship between Robert and Friedrich did not solidify well, and Friedrich noticed the more than platonic regard with which Robert gazed upon his teenage daughter. Thus, Robert came into Clara's orbit at a very young age, and what started as a Romeo and Juliet type romance eventually culminated in their marriage in 1840, very much against the wishes of Friedrich Wieck. The romance was a trend-setter, incorporating impassioned love letters, outpourings of heartfelt sentiment, and mutual dedication of songs of longing and unrequited love. They regarded each other with mutual respect, and their marriage functioned for a while as both blissful matrimony and musical osmosis. Clara even set a work schedule for the two of them in which they worked jointly on fugal and canonic exercises to improve their compositional techniques together, and Clara was able to practice for her concertizing while Robert composed. Dovetailing in and around extensive concert touring, Clara bore 8 children between 1841 and 1854, and Clara was the primary breadwinner for the family. In 1853, Clara and Robert made the acquaintance of someone who would alter the course of their existence, the young Johannes Brahms, who was at the time just 20 years old. Brahms played for the Schumanns, and they instantly recognized that he was perhaps the greatest compositional genius since Beethoven. They took it upon themselves to not only befriend him, but to help him musically and professionally, using their considerable connections to help Brahms forge his own. Unfortunately, in 1854, Robert's descent into madness escalated in an attempted suicide in which he threw himself into the Rhine River. Though he was rescued, he committed himself to a mental institution never to recover. In fact, for the outset of his convalescence, he refused to see Clara, probably out of shame and the desire to shield her. But Robert allowed Brahms to regularly visit him in the hospital. Clara was left in the lurch with 8 children and an incapacitated husband. And the depth of love Brahms felt for both Schumanns inspired him to live in the Schumann home, to take care of the children, and to attend the day-to-day needs of Clara and the children, while Clara, in desperate need of financial resources to continue supporting her family, practiced and departed on extensive concert touring. It is a near certainty that Brahms and Clara shared powerful romantic feelings for one another, and even Robert, while institutionalized, seems to have implied that he would approve of Brahms assuming his role as husband and father. After Robert's tragic death in 1856, the way seemed clear for Clara and Brahms to pursue their passion without restraint. Yet, they did not. Something occurred about which we can only guess, as they made the joint decision to destroy all private correspondences between them. It is plausible that they were aware of the possibility of people poking around their private business, either during their lives or after their deaths, and they clearly did not want people to know. Nevertheless, their friendship blossomed, albeit not without complications, and they continued interacting well into the 1890s. Clara was a talented composer, though not particularly prolific, as she suffered from a lack of confidence in this arena, perhaps after living in the shadow of such titans as Robert Schumann and Johannes Brahms. By the age of 36, she composed her last work, choosing henceforth to dedicate herself to a life as a pianist and proponent of her late husband's music. She also premiered many of Brahms's works and was among his most trusted confidants. In 1878, she was given a very enticing offer to become the first, and the only female, I might add, piano teacher at Dr. Hoch's newly founded conservatorium in Frankfurt. Dr. Hoch was a rich benefactor who bequeathed a great sum toward the foundation of this school, and his acquisition of Clara Schumann was a great feather in his cap. A well-off, famous pianist, Clara Schumann continued to tour as much as possible until 1891, when nerve damage in her arm forced her to stop playing the piano altogether. In 1896, after a long and fruitful life, Clara suffered a stroke and passed away. The respected French composer Ambroise Thomas bestowed upon Cecile Chaminade a most genuine compliment. This is not a woman who composes, but a composer who is a woman. Beautifully and simply stated, Chaminade was a great composer who happened to be born in France in 1857 and who died in Monte Carlo in 1944. Her life spanned a critical juncture in a world of political and musical upheaval. She would witness the zenith and subsequent rejection of tonality and romanticism, living well into the ascetic and antiseptic musical age of serial modernism. Perhaps that fact, coupled with the typical struggles of achieving success in a career mostly dominated by men, Chaminade's star rose and fell quickly and brightly, though her music has enjoyed a resurgence of popularity in recent years. Her full name was Cécile Louise Stéphanie Chaminade, and her earliest musical studies were under the guidance of her mother, who was an accomplished pianist and singer. Cécile's father did not approve of music as a profession for a woman, and forbade her from attending the Paris Conservatoire, though Cécile had shown tremendous promise as a young musician, even earning the praise and admiration of Georges Bizet. Per her father's regulations, she never earned a music degree, though she did pursue private studies with Benjamin Godard. At 18, she gave her recital debut in France, and in 1892, she debuted in England, garnering instant popularity. Her musical language, short character works in a programmatic vein, meshed well with English musical tastes during the turn of the century, and she would return there many times as a popular icon. In 1901, she married a music publisher named Louis Mathieu Carbonel. Not much is known of their marriage, and they did not have any children. His death shortly thereafter, in 1907, left her a widow, and she never remarried. Though her career experienced a brief pause around the time of her marriage, she resumed her professional activities, touring extensively for the first time in the United States, where, like in England, her music was met with warmth and popular acclaim. The positivity with which she was met inspired her to write a Concertstücke for piano and orchestra, which she premiered herself with the Philadelphia orchestra. Principally known as a miniaturist, Chaminade struggled to be taken seriously by critics for her larger-scale compositional endeavors, and thus she was relegated to the disparaged realm of, quote, salon composers. Though she enjoyed fame and financial success throughout England and America, her ascension to the echelon of serious composers remained elusive, in part due to her tonal romantic style, which was no longer in vogue, and partly due to the large body of small works she wrote. In other words, she got pigeonholed, much like a character actor who finds it difficult to be cast in leading roles. Nevertheless, Chaminade did attain high status with a certain portion of the public, and in her native France, she was the first female composer to receive the title of Chevalier in the Legion of Honor. Along with her declining health, her music faded further and further into obscurity in the 1920s and 30s, especially given the musical tide of that era promoting serialism and neoclassicism. And when she passed away in 1944 in Monte Carlo, she was a nearly forgotten bygone of a former era. Her legacy endures, not only through the hundreds of compositions she published, but also through her 1901 set of acoustical recordings in which she recorded herself playing a number of her piano pieces. I highly encourage you to check these out on YouTube. Just type in Chaminade plays Chaminade, and in particular, listen to her performance of Les Sylvains, which I will be performing for you during the aforementioned performance chat on July 2nd, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Chaminade's pianism was colorful, dynamic, and graceful, with a flexibility and tone quality that reflect her world-class sophistication as a musician. The story of the French composer Lili Boulanger is short and tragic. Born in 1893, she died in 1918, just after World War I. Her full name was Marie-Juliette Olga Lili Boulanger, and she came from a remarkably musical family. Her father, Ernest Boulanger, was a renowned composer and professor at the Paris Conservatoire, a winner himself of the highest honor in the music world, the Prix de Rome. Lili's mother was a Russian princess and former student of Ernest Boulanger at the Conservatoire. Lili's older sister, Nadia, who was 6 years older, went on to become one of the most influential composition teachers of the 20th century. In fact, even as Nadia studied herself at the Conservatoire, musicians such as Gabriel Fauré took note of young Lili's superior gifts, and by the age of 5, Lili was permitted to accompany 11-year-old Nadia to her classes at the Conservatoire, where she studied composition, theory, and counterpoint. Lili drew the attention of not only Fauré, but Viernet and Vidal as well, and she became the talk of the Conservatoire. In 1912, Lili competed for the Prix de Rome, but had to withdraw after collapsing during her performance. She re-entered the following year and became the first woman to win the composition prize. Many said that she should have won the top honor, the Prix de Rome, but that her gender was a factor in the judge's decision. We will never know for sure, of course. Nevertheless, Lili was immediately awarded a publication contract with Ricordi, one of the top publishing firms in Europe. her future as a composer was virtually assured, and she invested herself in advanced composition studies with Fauré and Caussade, cultivating her signature impressionist style, somewhat in the vein of Claude Debussy, but with a darker tinge. Many of her compositions touch upon grief and loss. In 1900, her father had passed away, and this deeply affected Lili. By 1914, Lili and Nadia were raising money for war efforts, and death and destruction were on everyone's minds. These factors, compounded with Lili's growing awareness that her own illness was accelerating and that she was likely to soon die, informed her musical language. There was a dark magic to her style, a longing for a better world, and a depiction of beauty and innocence at an unreachable distance. These qualities give her music a deeply melancholic overtone, and the modernism she embraced within the impressionistic language she adopted fused in her music in an entirely original and captivating way. Tragically, Lili died at age 24 from tuberculosis, her full potential as a composer and human being unrealized, a great loss to the world. The French pianist and composer Mélanie Bonis was born in 1858 and died in 1937 after a long and colorful life. Her full name was Mélanie Hélène Bonis, and she was raised in a strict Parisian Catholic middle-class family. She taught herself to play the piano as a small child, and after some coaxing, a friend and professor from the Paris Conservatoire managed to convince Mélanie's parents to allow her to take private music lessons. Mélanie entered the Paris Conservatoire at age 16, studying composition with none other than César Franck, alongside fellow students Debussy and Vierney. Though her work was met with approval, she experienced a number of disappointing sexist episodes where her male counterparts were promoted unfairly ahead of her due to gender. It was during this time that she took the pseudonym Mel to conceal her gender as a future published composer. One of her classmates was a voice major and poet named Amédée Landeli-Hettich, with whom she fell deeply in love. Their affair caused quite the scandal with her family, who strongly disapproved of the match. Ripped away from her lover, Mel was coerced into marriage with a businessman 25 years her senior, a father of 5 children already, Albert Domange. Mel was forced by her parents and Albert to quit her studies at the Conservatoire and assume the role of bourgeois housewife. Her professors and her colleagues were shocked, and for many years Mel Bonis disappeared entirely from the music scene, integrating fully into family life. She bore 3 children of her own with Albert, managed their imperious household and staff, and she became a typical French society lady. That is, until she again encountered her old lover, Hettich, at a social event. He, too, had married, and they resumed a tentative friendship that blossomed into a working relationship. Hettich encouraged Mel to resume her composing, and he even connected her with the reputable publisher Alphonse Leduc. They worked side by side as Mel set many of his poems to music, and their idyllic contact quickly revitalized their former feelings of passion. They became lovers again, and this time Mel became pregnant with his child. Given the social climate of the day, such a scandal, if it became public knowledge, would have brought great shame and embarrassment on both Mel's and Hedwich's families. They agreed that Mel would travel discreetly to Switzerland for health purposes, of course, where she would secretly give birth to this child with whom she must sever contact. Mel gave birth to a daughter, Madeleine, who was whisked away to be raised under the care of a former chambermaid. Mel would not be permitted to see Madeleine or contact her, but Hedwig was able to keep secret tabs on the girl as she grew up, feeding updates to Mel when possible without arousing suspicions within their households. Mel dove headfirst into her bourgeois lifestyle, reassuming her family life with renewed vigor and composing prolifically, all the while harboring a secret desire to be reunited with her long-lost illegitimate daughter. Mel's activities included her membership and eventual leadership of the Société des Compositeurs de Musique, SCM, through which she intersected with such figures as Massenet, Fauré, Saint-Saëns, and Berlioz, to name a few. Her life developed a steady rhythm as Madeleine grew up far away, but eventually Madeleine's foster mother passed away, and Madeleine needed a place to reside during the summer holidays. Hedwig managed to convince the girl and her caretakers that Mel was her godmother and that she could stay with the Domange family in Paris, much to Mel's personal delight, of course. Blissfully unaware of any wrongdoing, young Madeleine quickly fell in love with Mel's son, Edouard, her half-brother, and no one besides Mel knew the truth. Despite repeated attempts to force her daughter to break off the affair, Mel was finally compelled to reveal the truth of her own affair with Hedwig and to reveal her maternity. Though Madeleine was understandably shocked and angry, she did indeed break off the affair, and mother and daughter eventually grew closer. After Albert passed away, Madeleine moved in with her aging mother, who still composed, and they lived together in relative contentment until Mel's peaceful death in 1937. Our final featured heroine is American composer-pianist Amy Beach, who was born in New Hampshire in 1867 and died just outside Boston in 1944. Her maiden name was Amy Marcy Cheney, and like the other composers featured in this episode, she was a distinctive child prodigy. Her initial piano studies were with her mother, and she gave her first public recital at age 6. As Amy's talents grew, prominent musicians advised her parents to send her off to a famous European conservatory. For a number of reasons, her parents did not support that notion, instead hiring local talent to privately tutor her, including Karl Bayermann, a student of Liszt. Pianistically, Amy was nurtured by her instructors, but she pursued composition studies on her own, gleaning what she could through textbooks and intensive score study. With the pyrotechnical skills she had acquired as a pianist, her piano career blossomed as she made prominent debut performances in and around Boston, including critically acclaimed appearances with the Boston Symphony. In 1885, Amy married Henry Harris Aubrey Beach, a surgeon 24 years her senior, and a prominent music lover. She must have felt strongly motivated to marry at this time because her marriage included the terms of a contract later articulated by Amy herself. I must live according to his status, that is, function as a society matron and patron of the arts. I would never teach piano, an activity widely associated with women. I further agreed to limit performance to 2 public recitals per year, with profits donated to charity, and to devote myself more to composition than to performance. The period following her marriage was a productive one. She composed a number of her most important works, including her large-scale Gaelic symphony, Mass in E-flat, and her piano concerto, which she premiered with the Boston Symphony. Critics went wild for her music. She was proclaimed as the great American composer of her day, and her expanding fame led to interaction with other prominent musicians. She frequently performed as a soloist and in chamber music with the Kneisel Quartet, who premiered a number of her important chamber works. Things changed drastically for Amy Beach upon the death of her husband in 1910, followed closely by the death of her mother 7 months later. Her father had died in 1895, and her marriage had produced no children, so Amy found herself alone for the first time. She traveled to Europe, changing her name officially to Amy Beach, and spent the next 2 years as a tourist, resting and taking in the sights as much as possible. She resumed composing in 1912, premiering works around the European capitals, but her music did not find much traction there, as her sumptuous romantic style was a bit out of date for the current compositional trends. She subsequently returned to America in 1914, just after the outset of World War I, and, no longer bound to the terms of her marriage contract, she became affiliated with the New England Conservatory of Music. Though the music scene in America caught up to the rising popularity of dissonant modernism, Amy Beach continued to compose in her signature romantic style up until 1940, when she retired due to heart disease. Amy Beach died in 1944, leaving behind a legacy as one of America's most important composers. It is clear through our rediscovery of these women's accomplishments that they gave the world so much, burnishing legacies of beautiful and inspiring works of art, greatly enriched families, and important precedents for other women to follow in their footsteps. One can hope that as society matures and deepens, the continued motivation to remove obstacles from women's paths toward the pantheon of greats will gain traction and momentum, and that the 21st century will yield a true renaissance of genius composers, both male and female. Remember to join me on July 2nd at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to experience the gorgeous and transcendental music of these great composers as I celebrate their lives and work with a live performance. It has been a pleasure and privilege speaking with you during this episode of Get to Know the Music, and I can't wait to see you at all of our upcoming events.